Hello and welcome back to the Crime Reel. For today's true crime narration, we are returning to 1964 to look at the heartbreaking events of Pacific Airlines Flight 773. On the morning of Thursday the 7th of May 1964, various people were making their way to the airport to board a short flight from Reno, Nevada to San Francisco in California. 24-year-old Judy Stopp and her mother-in-law Clara had decided to take an overnight trip to Reno just for fun. They were heading back to San Francisco, where Judy's husband, 25-year-old Dale, was waiting to collect them at the airport. Two air traffic controllers, George S. Baldwin and Roger Varney from the Oakland Air Route Traffic Control Center in Fremont, had also gone to Reno for a night out and were due to return to work at 8 a.m. that morning. George was a father of 7 who had been awarded the Air Traffic Control Association Scroll the previous year for his role in saving a private pilot and 2 passengers who were lost in fog and clouds above the mountains near Red Bluff. Also boarding the flight were San Francisco police officer George Lacow and his wife, 88-year-old Reverend London Eakes, a retired Presbyterian minister who was due to fly on to Atlanta for an Emory University reunion. 42-year-old Helen Ulrich, who was en route to her sister's funeral in Missouri, and Roger Brander, a 34-year-old manager of a radio station who was making a business trip to San Francisco. The flight took off at 5:54 a.m. and it had a total of 33 passengers on board with a crew of 3. The pilot that day was Captain Ernest Clark. He was an experienced pilot who had been employed by Pacific Airlines for over 10 years. Now 52 years old, in his youth he had been a bomber pilot during World War II and had originally been reported as killed in action in the Mediterranean in 1944. However, in 1945, he was liberated from a German prisoner of war camp by Allied forces. Ernest, who had 3 daughters, was a widower, having lost his wife the previous year. His co-pilot was 31-year-old First Officer Ray Andres, the son of an FBI agent who was an expert in self-defense and judo. He was married with 4 young children. Completing the crew was the flight attendant, 30-year-old Margaret Schaefer. Margaret had a young daughter and had been flying for over 6 years. After leaving Reno, the flight made a quick stopover at Stockton Airport, where 2 people disembarked and a further 10 boarded, including the Kendrick family. 39-year-old Donald and 36-year-old Norma were taking their 2 sons, 3-year-old Richard and also Douglas, who was 1. They were going to San Francisco to catch an onward flight to Philadelphia. They were travelling to meet Norma's mother, who was due to meet her son-in-law and grandsons for the first time. The flight took off again from Stockton Airport at 6:38 a.m. and it was scheduled to land in San Francisco about half an hour later. At 6:48 a.m, the Oakland Air Route Traffic Control Center received a high-pitched, garbled radio message from the aircraft. It then disappeared from their radar screens. The plane was flying at an altitude of 5,000 feet and went into a steep dive of 2,100 feet at an airspeed of nearly 400 miles per hour. As the pilot attempted to pull the plane out of the dive, there was a steep climb back up to 3,200 feet. Observers along the flight path witnessed these extreme changes in the altitude of the flight. The Collins family were having breakfast as the plane passed overhead. Mr. Collins recalled that the plane was whining and the pilot appeared to be giving it everything it had. Another witness, Janice Anderson, recalls hearing the sound of an aeroplane engine sort of missing, spluttering. As she rushed outside, she heard the sound of the crash. Flight 773 had ploughed into a sloping hillside at a relative angle of approximately 90 degrees. The extreme force of the crash led to the almost total disintegration of the plane. All 44 people on board lost their lives. The carnage on the hillside was horrifying and spread across over 2 acres. Body parts, wreckage, shoes, clothing, suitcases and handbags were strewn all over the area. With the exception of the landing gear and the 2 engines, most of the wreckage was no larger than around a foot in diameter. Seatbelts were shredded at their roots due to the extreme force of the crash. Witness Mr. Collins and his son Douglas rushed to the crash site. "It was awful," he said. "I've seen wartime stuff, but this was worse. Women and children. My God." The cockpit area was so completely damaged by the impact that only 4 small pieces of the instrument panel were retrieved. No single portion of more than 8 square inches was recovered. Investigators began the mammoth and heartbreaking job of locating and identifying all 44 of the people on board. As relatives and friends began to find out that their loved ones had perished in a plane crash, it soon became apparent to investigators that this was definitely not an accident. A cocked and loaded revolver containing 6 spent cartridges had been found in the wreckage of the plane. It was initially assumed that this may have belonged to the police officer who was on board, George Lacow, but the serial numbers were not a match to any of his registered weapons. The FBI were brought in to work alongside the Civil Aeronautics Board. This was a forerunner to the National Transportation Safety Board. The FBI and CAB investigated exactly what had happened on board Flight 773. From background investigations, analysis of the items found at the crash site, including the flight data recorder and deciphering the final message received from the plane to air traffic control, they soon uncovered the truth. Everyone on board that day had different reasons for being there, but none were so sinister as that of 27-year-old Francisco Gonzalez. Francisco was a young man who had competed in the 1960 Olympic Games as part of the sailing team from the Philippines. The Olympians team finished in 24th place. By 1964, he was working in a warehouse in San Francisco, by which time he had accumulated significant debts. Over half of his monthly income had to go towards debt repayment, and his marriage was in tatters. His friends described him as being disturbed and depressed at this time in his life. He told his family and friends that he would die on either Wednesday the 6th of May or Thursday the 7th of May, and he would often talk about his impending death on a daily basis. On the evening of May the 6th, 1964, he bought a Smith & Wesson Model 27. It was a .357 Magnum revolver. He showed this revolver to numerous friends and told at least one person he intended to shoot himself. He headed to San Francisco Airport, where he purchased 2 insurance policies to a value of $105,000, for which his wife was the beneficiary. He boarded a flight from San Francisco to Reno with a return reservation on Flight 773 the next morning. He spent the night of the 6th of May gambling in the casinos of Reno, and when asked by one employee how he was doing, he replied that he did not care how much he lost because it won't make any difference after tomorrow. The 2 passengers who disembarked from the flight at Stockton confirmed that Francisco was seated at the front of the plane. Just minutes before the plane was due to land for a second time, Francisco burst into the cockpit where he shot at Captain Clark. It is believed that this shot hit the tubing of the captain's seat. This tubing was found in the wreckage. Francisco shot the pilot for a second time before taking aim at the co-pilot, Ray Andres. At this point, Ray made the final frantic transmission whilst attempting to pull the plane out of the dive. When this audio recording was cleaned up, Ray was heard saying, "Skipper's shot, we've been shot, help." Francisco then shot Ray again before turning the gun on himself as the plane went into its final fatal dive, killing everyone on board. This was the first incident in the United States of a pilot being shot by a passenger as part of a murder-suicide. and remains the worst incident of mass murder in modern Californian history. Captain Ernest Clark's daughter, Julie Clark, who was 15 at the time of her father's murder, became determined to become a pilot herself after the tragedy. She fulfilled that dream and became a commercial airline pilot, becoming one of the first female pilots to work for a major airline, and also she was an aerobatic airshow aviator. She remained a pilot for more than 45 years. That concludes today's story. However, I have 3 side articles that were written at the same time in the local and national newspapers. The first story was about the killer's family before he was known as the killer. It explains how Francisco, or Frank's brother, heard the news. He went to the scene of the crash and asked, "How can we have a funeral? How will I know if I am burying my brother?" The second story was about Arlie Lee, who worked for the San Francisco Examiner as a member of the advertising staff. She believed it was a woman's prerogative to change her mind. She was booked on the fateful flight 773, but in order to get an extra half hour at the casinos, she changed the flight to flight 771. Truly a lucky decision. And finally, one more extremely sad event where the dad of 7, George Baldwin, who worked at the Federal Aviation Agency as a radio controller, in this case, Mrs. June Baldwin had the call that George had died. Then, amazingly, 1 hour later, she was called and told that George had turned up alive in San Francisco. The 8 members of the family were celebrating this incredible news, but sadly, 15 minutes later, the phone rang again. Someone else told them that they were sorry to inform them that someone else was mistakenly identified as George in San Francisco. Such a tragic ending for the family. Rest in peace to all the victims of this crime. Thanks for listening, and please click like and subscribe if you are new to the channel. I'd like to say thank you to Stephen Luke, who a few months ago suggested that I should cover this case. And finally, following last week's video, I clearly had a problem with my Texas and Colorado. I'd just like to confirm that I do know where these locations are. So just to prove it, this is California, this is Texas, this is Colorado. This all just really goes to show that I'm not an AI channel. I'm a human being, and I always try my very best to give you the best recording I can. Okay, thank you very much for listening to The Crime Reel. Stay safe. Goodbye.